The crowd's roar, the flashing lights, the aura of invincibility. Ronda Rousey was the queen of the UFC. But behind the highlight reels and championship belts was a secret so damaging she's kept it buried for years. Now, she's finally speaking out. In a stunning confession, Rousey pulls back the curtain on a scandal that not only shattered her career, but forced her out of the sport she once ruled. What really happened inside the UFC's inner circle, and why is she telling the world now? Before Ronda Rousey ever set foot inside the UFC's octagon, she had already carved out a legacy as one of the most dangerous women in combat sports. Born into a family where grit was part of the DNA, her mother, Anne Maria DeMars, was the first American woman to win a World Judo Championship. Rousey was practically raised on the mat. Her journey was anything but easy. Plagued by a speech impediment as a child and the devastating loss of her father at just 8 years old, she learned early how to channel pain into purpose. That raw resilience carried her to the 2008 Beijing Olympics, where she became the first American woman to earn an Olympic medal in judo, taking home bronze. When she made the switch to MMA, the sport had never seen anything like her. In Strikeforce, she dispatched opponents with terrifying efficiency. Arm bars so fast and so brutal, they left crowds stunned and fighters wary. It wasn't just the submissions, it was the aura. Rousey had the look of someone who knew she was inevitable, and soon the UFC wanted in. Dana White, who once infamously claimed women would never fight in the UFC, reversed course, signing Rousey as the first female fighter in the promotion's history. Her rise was meteoric. Rousey's UFC debut in 2013 ended in yet another first-round armbar, setting the tone for a run of dominance rarely seen in the sport. 12 fights, 12 wins, most in under a minute. Pay-per-view numbers soared, media outlets couldn't get enough, and Hollywood came calling. She was more than a fighter. She was a brand, a cultural force, a household name. Yet behind the smiles for cameras and the championship belts, the machine was already in motion. Every endorsement, every fight, every interview was meticulously controlled by the UFC. And while it brought her fame and fortune, it also meant the walls were closing in. The more she succeeded, the more the promotion invested in her image, and the more difficult it became to step out of line. What no one outside her inner circle knew was that the very system that built her up would later be the one to break her down. The seeds of that downfall were already being planted, even as the world saw nothing but victory. At first glance, Ronda Rousey seemed untouchable. She was headlining cards, appearing in blockbuster films, gracing magazine covers, and earning more in endorsements than most fighters made in their entire careers. But success came with a cost that even she couldn't ignore. Her training camps became grueling marathons of physical punishment, and her body, already weathered from years of judo, was beginning to show signs of strain. Torn ligaments, nagging knee issues, and the constant threat of concussions started to stack up. Still, the UFC machine pressed on. Behind closed doors, Rousey began to feel the first pangs of burnout. Every press conference required her to be on. Every promotional shoot demanded perfection, and every soundbite was scrutinized for marketability. There were whispers of frustration between her camp and UFC executives over fight scheduling, media obligations, and even her public image. To the fans, she was the face of women's MMA, a fearless champion willing to fight anyone. In reality, she was caught in a cycle where her voice mattered less than the narrative the UFC wanted to tell. Friends and training partners noticed changes, more guarded conversations, fewer smiles in the gym, and an increasing reluctance to play the role of UFC's poster child. There were also rumblings about disagreements with management, discussions that never made it past closed doors. Some insiders claimed these disputes were about fighter pay structures, while others suggested it was about control. Specifically, how much of Rousey's career the UFC could dictate. The pressure cooker was heating up, but on the outside, inside, the cracks were invisible. It was during this period that Rousey began to hear more about certain understood arrangements between fighters and the organization. Nothing in writing, nothing on record, just industry whispers. For the time being, she kept those thoughts to herself, focusing instead on training and winning. But those whispers were about to grow louder, and once she started asking questions, the stability of her career would begin to unravel. The sources close to her alleged that tensions had been brewing long before the Holm fight. According to these insiders, Rousey had resisted participating in certain promotional activities tied to UFC sponsors, activities she claimed conflicted with her own personal deal. This, she argued, was part of an unwritten rule within the organization, that top fighters were expected to fall in line with corporate partnerships, even if it meant sacrificing personal gain. For years, she had quietly navigated around these expectations. Now, after a devastating loss, her leverage was gone. Rumors of heated arguments with UFC executives began to circulate. Some claimed that Rousey was given ultimatums, comply with the expectations, or risk being sidelined. To fans, her absence from the spotlight was chalked up to recovery and reflection. In truth, it marked the beginning of a deepening rift that would never fully heal. That unwritten rule she had danced around for years was about to become the center of a much bigger, much darker story, one that would ultimately push her out of the sport altogether. The first real flashpoint didn't come in the octagon. It came in a boardroom. According to people close to Ronda Rousey, a meeting in late 2016 set the stage for everything that followed. It was framed as a career alignment session, but Rousey quickly realized it was about something much bigger: the UFC's internal policies on sponsorships, fighter promotion, and the quiet but undeniable hierarchy of who gets pushed and who doesn't. The UFC had always been protective of its brand, but after the company's massive sale to WME-IMG for over $4 billion that year, the priorities shifted. Corporate sponsors were now king. New mandates trickled down that fighters were expected to promote certain brands, appear at specific events, and, most controversially, avoid public statements that could harm a partner relationship. To the casual fan, it sounded harmless, but for fighters with personal sponsorships or differing values, it became a financial and ethical minefield. Rousey was already known for doing things her way. She didn't want her image tied to companies she didn't believe in, and she refused to take part in promotional shoots that conflicted with her outside deals. The tension escalated when she allegedly turned down a request to endorse a controversial energy drink heavily backed by UFC executives. The rejection didn't go unnoticed. Whispers started in the locker rooms, stories from other fighters who claimed they'd lost main card spots or had contract renewals delayed after refusing similar requests. Around this time, former UFC fighters began speaking in vague terms about the pressure to play ball if you wanted favorable matchups or promotional pushes. Some hinted that compliance was quietly rewarded with better pay-per-view points or media opportunities, while defiance often meant being buried on undercards or frozen out entirely. Rousey, for the first time, began to see the UFC not just as a fight promotion, but as a political ecosystem where the wrong move could mean career suicide. In interviews years later, she would refer to this period as the shift, the moment she realized that winning fights wasn't the only way to keep your place at the top. And while she didn't name names at first, the tension between her and certain executives had become an open secret backstage. From this point forward, every press conference smile, every handshake photo with Dana White masked a battle brewing just beneath the surface. The tipping point came when the pressure stopped being subtle. According to Rousey, UFC executives began presenting her with contracts and promotional obligations that crossed a personal line. These weren't just sponsorship requirements, they were appearance clauses tied to companies she'd already publicly distanced herself from, and promotional work linked to personalities she didn't want to be associated with. The message was clear: either comply or risk losing prime fight slots. marketing support, and leverage in negotiation. Behind closed doors, Rousey pushed back. She reportedly confronted Dana White directly in one particularly tense meeting, telling him she wouldn't be a mouthpiece for brands I don't respect. White, in his usual blunt style, allegedly told her that in the UFC, you're either all in or you're out. For a fighter already balancing physical recovery from injuries and the mental strain of a high-profile loss, it felt like a thinly veiled threat. But the deeper she looked, the more she began to see patterns. Other fighters, some still active, others retired, told her privately about similar experiences. There were stories of rankings being manipulated to punish outspoken fighters, of sponsorship payouts being withheld until certain promotional appearances were completed, and of matchups being made specifically to sideline troublesome personalities. In Rousey's words, it was a system that could end your career without ever firing you. This was the moment her fight became bigger than just the next opponent. She began keeping mental notes, piecing together the connections between sponsor relationships, fight bookings, and media narratives. To her, it seemed the UFC had mastered the art of controlling fighters without ever leaving a paper trail. The line between sports and business wasn't blurred, it was erased entirely. For a while, she tried to keep her head down, hoping to focus on her comeback, but the demands only grew. When she refused to participate in a particularly high-profile campaign that clashed with her personal values, the consequences were immediate. Media leaks questioning her dedication, rumors about her training discipline, and anonymous sources suggesting she'd lost her edge. To Rousey, it felt coordinated, a reminder that the UFC could turn public perception against her with just a few well-placed calls. By the time Rousey was preparing for her return fight against Amanda Nunes in late 2016, her relationship with the UFC was in freefall. Publicly, the promotion framed her comeback as one of the biggest events in MMA history, a redemption arc for its fallen queen. Privately, Rousey knew the stakes were very different. The fight wasn't just about reclaiming the belt, it was about proving she still had value to an organization that was clearly tightening its grip on her career. The weeks leading up to UFC 207 were telling. Promotional materials heavily featured Nunes, an unusual move given Rousey's proven drawing power. Press events were carefully managed, with Rousey limiting her media appearances to avoid questions that might touch on the growing rift. According to insiders, there were even disputes over which sponsors would be visible during her walkout, with Rousey rejecting certain logos and UFC officials pushing back hard. The fight itself was brutal and swift. Nunes overwhelmed Rousey in just 48 seconds, a defeat that sent shockwaves through the MMA world. But in the aftermath, Rousey noticed something unusual. The UFC's promotional machine didn't try to protect her image. Instead, highlight reels and commentary seemed to emphasize her downfall, as if the organization was already pivoting to its next star. Behind the scenes, tensions boiled over. Meetings with UFC leadership became heated, with Rousey openly accusing executives of trying to push her out. Some reports claim she confronted Dana White about the rumors being fed to the media, only to be met with silence or deflection. Contracts for future fights were floated, but came with even stricter promotional obligations, conditions she saw as unacceptable. By early 2017, the writing was on the wall. Rousey wasn't just losing leverage, she was being squeezed out. Friends say she began to view every interaction with the UFC as a negotiation over her own autonomy, and the mental toll was becoming unbearable. In her mind, the fight game had changed. It wasn't about who was the best fighter anymore. It was about who was willing to play by rules that were never written down, but enforced all the same. That, she decided, was a game she was no longer willing to play. After her crushing defeat to Amanda Nunes, the official narrative painted Ronda Rousey as a fading star whose time at the top had simply run out. But according to Rousey, the reality was far more calculated. She claims her exit wasn't the natural end of a career. It was a carefully orchestrated push. The UFC, she says, was no longer interested in her as a top fighter, but as a marketable figure willing to play play ball with corporate directives. When she refused, she became expendable. In the months following UFC 207, offers for new fights were quietly floated her way. On paper, they looked like opportunities to regain her place in the spotlight. In reality, the terms were laced with conditions: mandatory sponsorship appearances, scripted media segments, and pre-approved talking points for every interview. The financial incentives were tied not only to performance, but to compliance. If she didn't play the part the UFC wanted, she risked losing hundreds of thousands in potential payouts. Rousey says it became clear that the company was preparing to sideline her entirely if she didn't agree. She began to notice small but telling signs: training facility access being delayed, promotional shoots mysteriously canceled, media inquiries rooted away from her. Some fighters might have seen these as minor inconveniences. To Rousey, they were pressure tactics, part of the UFC's soft power strategy to bend fighters without ever putting demands in writing. The final straw came when she was told her next bout, if she wanted one, would be buried on a card beneath fighters she had once headlined over. To Rousey, it was a deliberate humiliation, a way to diminish her brand and make her exit seem like a personal choice rather than a forced retreat. "I knew right then," she has said in later interviews, "they were done with me. The fights they wanted to give me weren't about competition. They were about control." With her trust in the organization shattered, Rousey quietly withdrew from active competition. She didn't hold a tearful press conference or announce her retirement in a grand spectacle. Instead, she walked away without giving the UFC the satisfaction of framing her exit. But that silence wouldn't last forever. The story she had been sitting on was too big and too dangerous to keep under wraps forever. For years, Ronda Rousey deflected questions about her UFC departure, offering vague answers about moving on or wanting new challenges. But eventually, the dam broke. In a candid sit-down interview, one she claimed was her first time speaking without a filter about the issue, she laid out the scandal in stark detail. According to Rousey, the UFC operated an unwritten system of compliance that rewarded fighters who aligned with corporate interests and quietly penalized those who didn't. It wasn't just about sponsorships, it was about silence. Fighters who knew about internal policies that skirted ethical lines were allegedly incentivized to keep quiet through favorable matchups, better pay-per-view cuts, and media protection. Those who resisted, Rousey claims, saw their rankings manipulated, their fight opportunities diminish, and their reputations quietly tarnished through planted media narratives. The most explosive part of her claim centered on fighter safety. Rousey alleged that the UFC had, on more than one occasion, fast-tracked fighters into high-profile bouts despite medical concerns that, if disclosed, could have led to fight cancellations. She says she was once pressured to downplay a serious injury in order to keep a main event intact, told outright that the show must go on, and that pulling out would cause irreparable damage to her standing. In her view, this wasn't just unethical, it was dangerous. She also detailed what she called contractual traps, where fighters were presented with last-minute amendments, tying future opportunities to brand commitments, often with no time for proper legal review. They controlled the whole environment, she told the interviewer. They could make or break your career without ever saying it out loud. You just knew. The interview sent shockwaves through the MMA world. Some fighters publicly supported her, sharing their own vague but corroborating stories. Others distanced themselves, unwilling to risk their standing in the promotion. The UFC, for its part, issued a brief statement denying her allegations and framing her comments as disappointing. But for fans who had watched Rousey's rapid rise and abrupt fall, the interview reframed everything. Her losses in the cage now looked less like the sole cause of her exit, and more like the final push in a long, calculated campaign to move her out. In the years after her UFC departure, Ronda Rousey's life took a sharp turn. She transitioned into professional wrestling with WWE, where her star power brought mainstream attention and record-breaking ticket sales. Hollywood roles followed, and while her acting career was met with mixed reviews, it allowed her to maintain a public presence on her own terms. Yet no matter how far she moved from MMA, the shadow of her UFC story story followed her. Fans debated endlessly whether her allegations were the truth, an exaggeration, or a personal vendetta. To some, she remained a trailblazer who shattered glass ceilings and exposed the ugly side of a billion-dollar industry. To others, she was a bitter former champion who couldn't accept the natural decline of her career. The UFC, for its part, continued to thrive without her, but the whispers never fully went away. Every time a fighter mysteriously fell out of title contention or seemed to vanish from promotional materials, Rousey's words resurfaced online. In interviews, she made it clear that her goal wasn't revenge. It was a warning. If you're going to step into that world, she said, know exactly what you're getting into. It's not just about fighting, it's about politics, control, and knowing when you're the product instead of the athlete. Her comments struck a chord with younger fighters who were just breaking into the sport, many of whom sought legal representation earlier in their careers as a result. Today, Rousey's legacy is a complex one. She will forever be remembered as the first woman to headline a UFC event, the first female champion in the organization, and the fighter who brought women's MMA into the mainstream, but she will also be remembered for pulling back the curtain on a system that, if her claims are true, operates on far more than athletic merit. Her story forces a question that still lingers in the minds of fans. How much of the UFC's glittering success is built on the silencing of its fighters? For Rousey, the answer is clear, and she's willing to live with the consequences of telling it. In her eyes, walking away wasn't the end of her career. It was the only way to reclaim it.